Quotes by Gandhi. Untouchability question is one of life and death for Hinduism. If untouchability lives, Hinduism perishes, and even India perishes. But if untouchability is eradicated from the Hindu heart, root and branch, then Hinduism has a definite message for the world. I want the culture of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. I refuse to live in other people's houses as an interloper, a beggar, or a slave. Will you not see the writings that these terrorists are writing with their blood? The Montfort reforms were only a method of further draining India of her wealth and of prolonging her servitude. No government deserves respect which holds cheap the liberty of its subjects. I would suffer every humiliation, every torture, absolute ostracism, and death itself to prevent the movement from becoming violent. Parliamentary politics cannot lead to freedom, but those congressmen who could not, for some reason, offer satyagraha or devote themselves to constructive work should not remain unoccupied and could express their patriotic energies through council work, provided they are not sucked into constitutionalism or self-serving. India is one vast prison house. I repudiate this law. M.K. Gandhi to Lord Irwin. At the individual level, Swaraj is vitally connected with the capacity for dispassionate self-assessment, ceaseless self-purification, and growing self-reliance. I look upon an increase in the power of the state with greatest fear, because although while apparently doing good by minimizing exploitation, it does the greatest harm to mankind by destroying individuality, which is at the root of progress. In the ideal state, there is no political power because there is no state. But this ideal is never fully realized in life. Hence, the classical statement of Thoreau that the government is best which governs the least is worthy of consideration. The views you express seem to be so diametrically opposed to those of the others and my own that I do not see any possibility of bridging them. Gandhi said the difference of outlook between him, Bose, and me as to the means is too well known for comment. Bose acknowledged that Gandhi's methods had their importance when he said in his speech from Tokyo, "Though personally I believe that this method will not succeed in bringing us complete independence, there is no doubt that it has greatly helped to rouse and unify the Indian people and also to keep up a movement of resistance against the foreign government." War, said Gandhi, demoralizes those who are trained for it. It brutalizes men of naturally gentle nature. Gandhi developed the idea of village Sarvodaya, back to the roots vision, when production was simultaneous with consumption and distribution, and the vicious circle of money economy was absent. Production was for immediate use and not for distant markets. Men go on saving labor till thousands are without work and thrown on the open streets to die of starvation. He was not against instrument and machinery that saved individual labor. He wrote that mechanization is good when the hands are too few for the work intended to be accomplished. It is an evil when there are more hands than required for the work, as in the case in India. God is truth and love. God is ethics and morality. God is fearlessness. God is the source of light and life. Yet He is above and beyond all these. God is conscience. He is even the atheism of the atheist. For in His boundless love, God permits the atheist to live. To call women the weaker sex is a libel. It is man's injustice to women. Gandhi considered women's dharma to take care of the home. If they do not follow dharma, the people would be totally destroyed. Domestic slavery of women is a symbol of our barbarism, and she should be free from this incubus. He also wrote, "Women may not look for protection to men. They must rely on their own strength and purity of character and on God, as did Draupadi of old." Literacy in itself is no education. Gandhi to the government's insensitivity to Indian public opinion. There is to be no democracy for India if Britain can prevent it. Communal harmony could not be permanently established in our country so long as highly distorted versions of history were taught in her schools and colleges through the history textbooks. Here is a mantra, a short one that I give you. You may imprint it on your hearts and let every breath of yours give expression to it. The mantra is do or die. We shall either free India or die in the attempt. We shall not live to see the perpetuation of our slavery. Though the need for non-violence was always reiterated, Gandhi's mantra of do or die represents the militant mood of Gandhi. The question of majority and minority community is a creation of the British government and would disappear with their withdrawal. Hinduism dies if untouchability lives. Untouchability has to die if Hinduism is to live. Quotes about Gandhi. As Judith Brown writes, Gandhi seems to have visualized a loose linkage of independent village republics as the ideal form of the state. He can therefore properly be called an anarchist. Gandhi preached female virtues of bravery and independence and a capacity to bear suffering. The model he offered to Indian women was the virtuous and faithful wife, says Judith Brown. The deeper reason of intention and motive for the company's acquisition of vast areas of territory are more obscure, for the expansion occurred in such different parts of India at different times. In each particular situation, the precise British interests at stake varied, and the perceived damage to them, as did the relative weight in decision-making of different British groups concerned in Indian affairs, said Judith Brown. A man who cares nothing for sensual pleasure, nothing for riches, nothing for comfort or praise or promotion, but is simply determined to do what he believes to be right. He is a dangerous and uncomfortable enemy because his body, which you can always conquer, gives you so little purchase upon his soul. Gilbert Murray on Gandhi. Gandhi was the best policeman the British had in India. Ellen Wilkinson. Gandhiji's body is in jail, but his soul is with you. India's prestige is now in your hands. You must not use any violence under any circumstances. You will be beaten, but you must not resist. You must not even raise a hand to ward off blows. Sarojini Naidu. Subhash Chandra Bose. So far as Bengal is concerned, Vivekanand may be regarded as the spiritual father of the modern nationalist movement. The ultimate object of the revolutionaries is not terrorism but revolution, and the purpose of the revolution is to install a national government. The Government of India Act 1919 forged fresh fetters for the people. H. Asquith called Hunter Report one of the worst outrages in the whole of our history. To sound the order of retreat just when public enthusiasm was reaching the boiling point was nothing short of a national calamity. The principal lieutenants of the Mahatma Deshbandhu Das, Pandit Motilal Nehru and Lala Lajpat Rai, who were all in prison, shared the popular resentment. In the first place, we must give clear and unequivocal expression to what I have been feeling for some time past, namely that the time has come for us to raise the issue of Swaraj and submit our national demand to the British government in the form of an ultimatum. Bose said he would yield to none in my respect for his Gandhi's personality, adding that it will be a tragic thing for me if I succeed in winning the confidence of other people but fail to win the confidence of India's greatest man. Later, Bose said that the service which Mahatma Gandhi has rendered to India and to the cause of India's freedom is so unique and unparalleled that his name will be written in gold, in letters of gold, in our national history for all time. Bose is quoted as saying, "You cannot have a so-called democratic system if that system has to put through economic reforms on a socialistic basis. Therefore, we must have a political system, a state, of an authoritarian character." Bose expressed the opinion that in India there should be a synthesis of what modern Europe calls socialism and fascism. He called this Samyavad. Industrialization does not mean that we turn our back on cottage industries. It only means that we shall have to decide which industries should be developed on a cottage only means that on a cottage basis and which on a large scale basis. The status of women should be raised, and women should be trained to take a larger and more intelligent interest in public affairs. It is impossible for one half of the nation to win freedom without the active sympathy and support of the other half. National reconstruction will be possible only with the aid of science and our scientists. Swami Vivekananda. No other religion preaches the dignity of humanity in such a lofty strain as Hinduism, and no other religion on earth treads upon the poor and the low in such a fashion as Hinduism. A country where millions have nothing to eat and where few thousand holy men and Brahmins suck the blood of the poor and do nothing for all of them, nothing at all for them, is not a country but a living hell. Is this religion or a dance of death? Forget not that the lower classes, the ignorant, the poor, the illiterate, the cobbler, the sweeper are thy flesh and blood, thy brothers. If there is a sin in the world, it is weakness. Avoid all weakness. Weakness is sin. Weakness is death. Swami Vivekananda. B.R. Ambedkar. Unfortunately, no Brahmin scholar has so far come forward to play the part of a Voltaire, who had the intellectual honesty to rise against the doctrines of the Catholic Church in which he was brought up. A Voltaire among the Brahmins would be a positive danger to the maintenance of a civilization which is contrived to maintain Brahmanic supremacy. Any claim for the share of power by the minority is called communalism, while the monopolizing of the whole power by the majority is called nationalism. B.R. Ambedkar. Jawaharlal Nehru. The rising middle class were politically inclined and were not so much in search of a religion, but they wanted some cultural roots to cling onto that would reduce the sense of frustration and humiliation that foreign conquest and rule had produced. Political barrier was created around them, isolating them from the rest of India and reversing the unifying and amalgamating process which has been going on for centuries. The barrier was a small one at first, for the electorates were very limited, but with every extension of a franchise it grew and affected the whole structure of political and social life like some canker which corrupted the entire system. Canker is stone. Nehru's vision, the basic goal before Indian people as before people of the world, is abolition of capitalism and establishment of socialism. We are provided with a car, all brakes and no engine. The war was the result of the inner contradictions of capitalism maturing since the end of World War I. Dominion status concept is dead as a doornail. There has been a difference of a generation or more in the development of the Hindu and the Muslim middle class, and that difference continues to show itself in many directions. Political, economic and other. It is this lag which produces a psychology of fear among the Muslims. The truth is that we were tired men and we were getting on in years too. Few of us could stand the prospect of going to prison again. And if we had stood out for a united India as we wished it, prison obviously awaited us. We saw the fires burning in the Punjab and heard every day of the killings. The plan for partition offered a way and we took it. The English were an imperial race, we were told, with God-given right to govern us and keep us in subjection. If we protested, we were reminded of the tiger qualities of an imperial race. Bal Gangadhar Tilak. The extremists of today will be the moderates of tomorrow, just as the moderates of today were the extremists of yesterday. Swaraj or self-government is essential for the exercise of Swadharma. Without Swaraj, there could be no social reform, no industrial progress, no useful education, no fulfillment of national life. That is what we seek. That is why God has sent us to the world to fulfill Him. God has not conferred upon the foreigners the grant inscribed on a copper plate of the kingdom of Hindustan. Do not circumscribe your vision like a frog in a well. Get out of the penal code and enter the extremely high atmosphere of the Srimad Bhagavad Gita and consider the actions of great men. Montfort reforms were termed unworthy and disappointing. A Sunless Dawn by Tilak, even as Annie Besant found them unworthy of England to offer and India to accept. He who does what is beneficial to the people of this country, be he a Mohammedan or an Englishman, is not alien. Alienness has to do with interests. Alienness is certainly not concerned with white or black skin or religion. The government has converted the entire nation into a prison, and we are all prisoners. Going to prison only means that from a big cell one is confined to a smaller one. It was at best an opportunist movement. It opened opportunities for treacheries and hypocrisies. It enabled some people to trade in the name of patriotism. Lala Lajpat Rai. The blows which fell on me today are the last nails driven into the coffin of British imperialism. Lala Lajpat Rai. Political freedom is the life breath of a nation, declared Aurobindo. Swaraj is the fulfillment of the ancient life of India under modern conditions. The return of Satyug, of national greatness, the resumption by her of her great role of the teacher and guide. Self-liberation of the people for final fulfillment of the Vedantic idea in politics. That is the true Swaraj for India. Aurobindo Ghosh. The enormity of the measures taken by the government in the Punjab for quelling some local disturbances has, with a rude shock, revealed to our minds the helplessness of our position as British subjects in India. The very least that I can do for my country is to take all consequences upon myself in giving voice to the protest of the millions of my countrymen, surprised into a dumb anguish of terror. The time has come when badges of honor make our shame glaring in the incongruous context of humiliation. Rabindranath Tagore. Bhagat Singh. Revolution does not necessarily involve sanguinary strife, nor is there a place in it for personal vendetta. It is not the cult of bomb and pistol. By revolution we mean the present order of things, which is based on manifest injustice, must change. Peasants have to free themselves not only from the foreign yoke, but also from the yoke of landlords and capitalists. He also said, the struggle of India will continue so long as a handful of exploiters continue to exploit labor of common people to further their own interests. It matters little whether these exploiters are British capitalists, British and Indian capitalists in alliance, or even purely Indians. Bhagat Singh. To be a revolutionary, one required immense moral strength, but one also required criticism and independent thinking. Dadabhai Nauroji. India Reform Tract 2 says it is an exhausting drain upon the resources of the country, the issue of which is replaced by no reflex. It is an extraction of the lifeblood from the veins of national industry, which no subsequent introduction of nourishment is furnished to restore. It is not the pitiless operations of economic laws, but it is the thoughtless and pitiless action of the British policy. It is the pitiless eating of India's substance in India, and the further pitiless drain to England. In short, it is the pitiless perversion of economic laws by the sad bleeding to which India is subjected that is destroying India. Under the native despot, the people keep and enjoy what they produce, though at times they suffer some violence. Under the British India despot, the man is at peace, there is no violence. His substance is drained away, unseen, peaceably and subtly. He starves in peace and peaceably perishes in peace with law and order. The offer of Crux really gave us nothing. If we accepted this offer, we might have cause to rue it in future. In case the British went back on their word, we should not even have the justification for launching a fresh struggle. War had given India an opportunity for achieving her freedom. We must not lose it by depending upon a mere promise. Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. Congress as well as the Muslim League had accepted partition. The real position was, however, completely different. The acceptance was only in a resolution of the AICC of the Congress and on the register of the Muslim League. The people of India had not accepted partition with free and open minds. Some had accepted it out of sheer anger and resentment, and others out of a sense of despair. Lal Bahadur Shastri said, the unique thing about our country is that we have Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikh, Parsis and people of all other religions. We have temples and mosques, gurudwaras and churches, but we do not bring all this into politics. This is the difference between India and Pakistan. He, Shastri, wore no ideological blinkers. He saw facts as they were in all their starkness. Chronic food shortages made him shift from basic industries to agriculture. Roaring black markets persuaded him to make relative shift from controls to incentives. and the glaring inefficiency of the public sector made him accept a larger role for the private sector and in foreign investment. He also took measures to shift the locus of economic decision making from the planning commission to the ministries and from the center to the states, said P. N. Dhar. Raja Ram Mohan Roy. I regret to say that the present system of religion adhered to by the Hindus is not well calculated to promote their political interests. It is, I think, necessary that some change should take place in their religion, at least for the sake of their political advantage and social comfort. H.C.E. Zacharias said, Rajaram Mohan Roy and his Brahmo Samaj from the starting point for all the various reform movements, whether in Hindu religion, society or politics, which have agitated modern India. Mahadev Govind Ranade. The dead and the buried are dead. The dead and the buried are dead, buried and burnt once for all, and the dead past cannot therefore be revived except by a reformation of the old materials into new organized forms. Keshav Chandra Sen. Whoever worships the true God daily must learn to recognize all his fellow countrymen as brethren. Surendranath Banerjee describes the Derosians as the pioneers of the modern civilization of Bengal, the conscript fathers of our race, whose virtues will excite veneration and whose failings will be treated with gentlest consideration. Gopal Hari Deshmukh. If religion does not sanction social reform, then change religion. Pattabhi Siddharamaiah. We cannot blame them for the attitude they adopted as pioneers of Indian political reform, any more than we can blame the brick and mortar that is buried 6 feet deep in the foundation and plinth of a modern edifice. They have made possible the superstructure, story by story, by colonial self-government, home rule within the empire, Swaraj, and on top of all, complete independence. Surendranath Banerjee. Swadeshism during the days of its potency colored the entire texture of our social and domestic life. Madanlal Dhingra. Neither rich nor able, a poor son like myself can offer nothing but his blood on the altar of mother's deliverance. May I be reborn of the same mother, and may I re-die in the same sacred cause till my mission is done and she stands free for the good of humanity and to the glory of God. A.C. Majumdar. After nearly 10 years of painful separation and wandering through the wilderness of misunderstood and mazes of unpleasant controversies, both wings of Indian Nationalist Party have come to realize the fact that united they stand but divided they fall. Surya Sen. Humanism is a special virtue of a revolutionary. Rani Gadinliu, a Naga leader. We are free people, the white men should not rule over us. Justice Krishna Iyer. It would thus appear that Ambedkar and Gandhi had common allergy for social evil and imperial injustice. But a fundamental difference more apparent than real demarcated the two minds. R.C. Dutt. Taxation raised by the king, says the Indian poet, is like the moisture sucked up by the sun, to be returned to the earth as fertilizing rain. But the moisture raised from the Indian soil now descends as fertilizing rain largely on other lands, not on India. Sachidanand Sinha. Trade cannot thrive without efficient administration, while the latter is not worth attending to in the absence of profits of the former. So always with the assent and often to the dictates of the Chamber of Commerce. The government of India is carried on, and this is the white man's burden. Maulana Muhammad Ali. We divide and they rule. Aga Khan. The independent sovereign nation of Pakistan was born in the Muslim University of Aligarh. Wali Khan. The British were neither the foes of the Hindus nor friends of the Muslims. They set up Pakistan not as a gesture of friendship towards the Muslim, but under the compulsions of their international policies. Muhammad Ali Jinnah. I alone, with the help of my secretary and my typewriter, won Pakistan for the Muslims. G.V. Joshi. Expenditure on railways should be seen as an Indian subsidy to British industries. Sayyid Ahmad Khan. All prophets had the same din, faith, and every country had different prophets. R.C. Majumdar. The Dutch rivalry with the English during the 17th century was more bitter than that of the Portuguese. The policy of the Dutch in the East was influenced by two motives. One was to take revenge on Catholic Spain, the foe of their independence, and her ally, Portugal, and the other was to colonize and establish settlements in the Indies with a view to monopolizing commerce in that region. They gained their first object by the gradual decline of Portuguese influence. The realization of their second object brought them into bitter competition with the English. It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that the so-called First National War of Independence of 1857 is neither first nor national nor war of independence. R.C. Majumdar. There is, however, no basis for the claim that civil disobedience movement directly led to independence. The campaigns of Gandhi came to an ignoble end about 14 years before India achieved independence. During the First World War, the Indian revolutionaries sought to take advantage of German help in the shape of war materials to free the country by armed revolt. But the attempt did not succeed. During the Second World War, Subhash Chandra Bose followed the same method and created the INA. In spite of brilliant planning and initial success, the violent campaigns of Subhash Bose failed. The battles for India's freedom were also being fought against Britain, though indirectly by Hitler in Europe and Japan in Asia. None of these scored direct success, but few would deny that it was the cumulative effect of all the three that brought freedom to India. In particular, the revelations made by the INA trial and the reaction it produced in India made it quite plain to the British, already exhausted by the war, that they could no longer depend upon the loyalty of the sepoys for maintaining their authority in India. This had probably the greatest influence upon their final decision to quit India. R.C. Majumdar. Bipin Chandra. A few historians have late initiated a new trend, described by its proponents as subaltern, which dismisses all previous historical writing, including that based on a Marxist perspective, as elite historiography, and claims to replace this old blinkered historiography with what it claims is a new people's or subaltern approach. The period from 1858 to 1905 was the seed time of Indian nationalism, and the early nationalists sowed the seed well and deep. Satish Chandra. The landing of Vasco da Gama at Calicut in 1498 is generally regarded as the beginning of a new era in world history, especially in the relationship between Asia and Europe. Although Asia and Europe had been in commercial relations with each other since antiquity, the opening of the direct sea relations between the two was not only the fulfillment of an old dream. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, the Phoenicians had rounded Africa in the 6th century BC. It presaged big increase of trade between the two. This, however, was only one of the objectives of the Portuguese. For the Portuguese, the opening of a new sea route to India would give a big blow to the Muslims, the Arabs, and Turks, who were the traditional enemies of Christianity and were posing a new threat to Europe by virtue of the growing military and naval power of the Turks. A direct sea link with India would displace the virtual monopoly of the Arabs and Turks over the trade in eastern goods, especially spices. They also vaguely hoped by their exploration of Africa they would be able to link up with the kingdom of the legendary Prior John and be in a position to attack the Muslims from two sides. Thus, the commercial and religious objectives supported and justified each other. The roots of the disintegration of the Mughal Empire may be found in the medieval Indian economy. The stagnation of trade, industry, and scientific development within the limits of that economy, the growing financial crisis which took the form of a crisis of the Jagirdari system and affected every branch of state activity, the inability of the nobility to realize in the circumstances their ambitions in the service of the state, and consequently the struggle of factions and the bid of ambitious nobles for independent dominion, the inability of the Mughal emperors to accommodate the Marathas and to adjust their claims within the framework of the Mughal Empire, and the consequent breakdown of the attempts to create a composite ruling class in India, and the impact of all these developments on politics at the court and in the country, and upon the security of the northwestern passes. Individual failings and faults of character also played their due role, but they have necessarily to be seen against the background of these deeper, more impersonal factors. Shashi Tharoor. For centuries, the handloom weavers of Bengal had produced some of the world's most desirable fabrics, especially the fine muslins, light as woven air, that were coveted by European dressmakers as late as the mid 18th century. Bengal's textiles were still being exported to Egypt, Turkey, and Persia in the west, and to Java, China, and Japan in the east, along well-established trade routes, as well as to Europe. In the 100 years after Plassey, the East India Company, with an army of 260,000 men at the start of the 19th century, and the backing of the British government and Parliament, many of whose members were shareholders in the enterprise, extended its control over most of India. The company conquered and absorbed a number of hitherto independent or autonomous states, imposed executive authority through a series of highborn governors generals appointed from London, regulated the country's trade, collected taxes, and imposed its fiat on all aspects of Indian life. For most of the colonial era, the story of India manufacturing was of displacement, and defeat. What happened to India's textiles was replicated across the board. From the great manufacturing nation described by Sunderland, India became a mere exporter of raw materials and foodstuffs, raw cotton, as well as jute, silk, coal, opium, rice, spice, and tea. With the collapse of its manufacturing and the elimination of manufactured goods from its export rosters, India's share of world manufacturing exports fell from 27% to 2% under British rule. Deindustrialization was a deliberate British policy, not an accident. British industry flourished and Indian industry did not because of systematic destruction abetted by tariffs and regulatory measures that stacked the decks in favor of British industry conquering the Indian market rather than the other way around. S.B. Chaudhary. First War of Independence, it certainly was. As in the whole canvas of the recorded history of India, it would be difficult to find a parallel to this gigantic anti-foreign combine of all classes of people and of many provinces of India. There was never a war in India lasting continuously for more than a year, and simultaneously in all the regions which had for its objective the abasement and ejectment of the alien ruling power. The revolt was the first combined attempt of many classes of people to challenge a foreign power. This is a real, if remote, approach to the freedom movement of India of a later age. S.N. Sen. The mutiny became a revolt and assumed a political character when the mutineers of Meerut placed themselves under the King of Delhi, and a section of the landed aristocracy and civil population decided in his favor. What began as a fight for religion ended as a war of independence. B.L. Grover. Lord Wellesley resorted to aggressive application of the subsidiary alliance system to extend British dominion in India as a defensive countermeasure against the imperialistic designs of France and Russia. From 1798 to 1818, the British motives were consciously imperialistic. Lord Hastings further carried the policy of Wellesley and treated India as a conquered rather than an acquired country. Thereafter, the British seemed to work on a set design to conquer the whole of India and even some neighboring states. J.N. Sarkar. The Mughal Empire and with it the Maratha overlordship of Hindustan fell because of the rottenness of the core of Indian society. The rottenness showed itself in the form of military and political helplessness. The country could not stand itself. Royalty was hopelessly depraved or imbecile. The nobles were selfish and short-sighted. Corruption, inefficiency, and treachery disgraced all branches of the public service. In the midst of this decay and confusion, our literature, art, and even true religion had perished. Irfan Habib. Various explanations are put forward for the revolts which brought about the collapse of the Mughal Empire. Here, our main concern is with what our 17th and early 18th century authorities have to say. And it will be seen that they, at any rate, put the greatest store by the economic and administrative causes of the upheaval and no little of religious reaction or national consciousness. Thus was the Mughal Empire destroyed. No new order was or could be created by the forces ranged against it. Mohibul Hasan. Tipu has been regarded by some writers as the first Indian nationalist and a martyr for India's freedom, but this is a wrong view arrived at by projecting the present into the past. In the age in which Tipu lived and ruled, there was no sense of nationalism or an awareness among Indians that they were a subject people. It will therefore be too much to say that Tipu waged war against the English for the sake of India's freedom. Actually, he fought in order to preserve his own power and independence. Dr. K. Datta, revolt of 1857 to have been in the main a military outbreak, which was taken advantage of by certain discontented princes and landlords whose interests had been affected by the new political order. It was never all Indian in character, but was localized, restricted, and poorly organized. Tarachand. It has to be admitted that the war against the British was not inspired by any sentiment of nationalism, for in 1857 India was not yet politically a nation. It is a fact that the Hindus and Muslims cooperated, but the leaders and the followers of the two communities were moved by personal loyalties rather than loyalty to a common motherland. Anil Seal. System of nomination, representation, and election were all means of enlisting Indians to work for imperial ends. Percival Spear. The production of histories of India has become very frequent in recent years and may well call for some explanations. The reason is a twofold one. It changes in the Indian scene requiring a reinterpretation of the facts and changes in the attitudes of historians about the essential elements of Indian history. Clive was not a founder but a harbinger of the future. He was not a planner of empire but an experimenter who revealed something of the possibilities. Clive was the forerunner of the British Empire. The passions of the mutineers were centered on their grievances, not on larger ideals. With limitations of time, knowledge, and understanding, it was virtually impossible to deal adequately with the often vital accessories of a boundary line, such as the location of the canal headwaters in relation to the canals themselves, communication by road and rail, the fate of mixed or isolated population, and such invisible problems as the location of pasture lands in relation to villages, flocks, and herds. Sidney Owen. Bahadur Shah I was the last emperor of whom anything favorable can be said. Henceforth, the rapid and complete abasement and practical dissolution of the empire are typified in the incapacity and political insignificance of its sovereigns. A common impression is that the decline fall of the Mughal Empire was due to the degeneracy of its sovereigns, but it was irretrievably ruined in the reign of Aurangzeb, a monarch of great ability, energy, and determination, but lacking in political insight and a bigoted Mussulman. He struck the first mortal blow by reversing Akbar's wise and generous policy of ignoring distinctions of race and religion, and reimposing the jizya or poll tax on his Hindu subjects, whereby he estranged them and turned the noblest and most warlike of them, the Rajputs, hitherto the staunchest supporters of the throne, into deadly and persistent enemies. And Shivaji and his followers not only vindicated their independence but struck a second mortal blow at the integrity of the empire. They destroyed its military reputation. They exhausted its accumulated treasure. They spread disorder and devastation over the Deccan and beyond it. They established an imperium in imperio. Thus the empire, though not dissolved, was hopelessly debilitated. The effective authority of the central government was henceforth in abeyance. Nadir Shah, after inflicting the extremity of humiliation on the emperor and his capital, annexed the imperial territory west of the Indus. The dissolution of the empire was complete. Wellesley converted the British Empire to India to the British Empire of India. From one of the political powers in India, the company became the supreme power in India and claimed the whole country as its sole protectorate. From Wellesley's time onwards, the defense of India was the company's responsibility. Walter Reed, a 1950 colonial officer, paper disarmingly says that Britain, as a seafaring and trading nation, had long been a collector of islands and peninsulas. In a much quoted remark, Sir John Seeley, the Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, said something similar in 1883. We seem as it were to have conquered and peopled half the world in a fit of absence of mind. That didn't mean quite what it seemed to say. What Seeley meant was that there had not been a coherent policy behind Britain's imperial expansion. There had been an incoherent set of policies. The 1950 paper explained that the collection of islands and peninsulas was assembled to protect trade and the sea routes. The motive for empire was selfish. The motivation consisted of desires which interlocked: desires for wealth, for strategic positions from which to defend the wealth, and for prestige, the inevitable component of wealth. In the process, numberless hundreds of thousands of native populations were slaughtered. Almost always, the subject races, even the most sophisticated and educated among them, were regarded as and made to feel inferior to the ruling caste. The systematic failure of British governments to contemplate or prepare for any planned transfer of power to India is epitomized by the fact that a man of Radcliffe's background and lack of experience, he had never been east of Gibraltar before he came to India, should have been asked to embark on such a fundamental task so very late in the day. Read. He, Radcliffe, tried to take account of irrigation canals and water supplies so that there was enough water in the central Punjab, but on the scale with which he was dealing, he was bound to make mistakes. If villages were bisected by the boundary, they were separated from the villagers, fields, railway stations from the towns they served, and communities from the resources on which they relied. Devotion was intended to tie in a larger element of society to the status quo. But giving powers to local communities meant that energies which would have been applied against the imperial power was dissipated into communal rivalry. Division always worked for Britain's benefit. In Montfort, despotism proclaimed its benevolence. The mischief of the trial and condemnation of Tilak would be greater than if you left him alone. John Morley. Reforms may not save the Raj, but if they don't, nothing else will. The reforms of 1909 afforded no answer and could afford no answer to Indian problems. Montfort Report. When the cabinet used the expression ultimate self-government, they probably contemplated on an intervening period of 500 years. Lord Curzon. The Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions while in India is to assist it to a peaceful demise. We have no right to seize Sindh, yet we shall do so, and a very advantageous, useful, humane piece of rascality it will be. Charles Napier. To remove such brutal tyrants, the Amirs, was worthy of England's greatness. The conquest of Sindh is therefore no iniquity. Charles Napier. P. E. Roberts. Under Auckland and his cabinet of secretaries, British policy in India had fallen to a lower level of unscrupulousness than ever before, and the plain fact is that the treatment of Sindh from this time onward, however expedient politically, was morally indefensible. The diarchy of the double executive was open to almost every theoretical objection that the armory of political philosophy can supply. The process of constitutional advance in India is determined by the need to attract Indian collaborators to the Raj. B. R. Tomlinson. The British cabinet saw the growing rift between the Congress and the Muslim League as their trump card. Both Linlithgow and the cabinet looked to the rivalry of the Congress and League as their most useful weapon against the demand of either. Francisco de Almeida. As long as you may be powerful at sea, you will hold India as yours, and if you do not possess this power, little will avail you a fortress on shore. Alfonso de Souza. The Portuguese entered India with the sword in one hand and the crucifix in the other. Finding much gold, they laid aside the crucifix to fill their pocket, and not being able to hold them up with one hand, they were grown so heavy they dropped the sword too. Being found in this posture by those who came after, they were easily overcome. J. R. Seeley. The struggle between Dupleix and Clive in India, the defense of Arcot, and the deeds which led to the founding of our Indian Empire, all these events were part of a desperate struggle for supremacy between England and France. Alfred Leal. We may regard Dupleix as the most striking figure in the short Indian episode of that long and arduous contest for transmarine dominion which was fought out between France and England in the 18th century. Although it was far beyond his power to influence the ultimate destiny of either nation in India, and although the result of his plans was that we accomplished for ourselves against the French exactly everything that the French intended to accomplish for themselves against us. Clive. It is certain, moreover, that the conception of an Indian empire had already been formed by others besides Dupleix, and that more than one clear-headed observer had perceived how easily the whole country might be subdued by an European power. H. Dodwell. While the English received supplies of food and money from Bengal, recruits of men from Europe, and grain from their northern settlements, the French could receive nothing but what came to them laboriously by land. The first was constantly strengthened, the second was constantly weakened, and this enabled Coote to establish his military superiority over Lally in the field and to hem him within the walls of Pondicherry. John Wilson. Nader Shah was Mughal emperor for only 57 days in 1739, but those days created aftershocks that transformed India's politics. They broke existing centers of authority, massively shrinking the scope of Mughal power. They set loose bands of mounted warriors who ransacked the countryside seeking wealth from villages and towns. They pushed traders behind the walls of whichever power had the strongest forts. For a short period, plunder rather than negotiation became the most effective tool for creating new centers of wealth. Those 57 days laid the ground which allowed the East India Company to conquer territory in India for the first time. William Irwin. The more I study the period, the more I am convinced that military inefficiency was the principal, if not the sole cause of that empire's final collapse. All other defects and weaknesses were as nothing in comparison with this. Long before it disappeared, it had lost all military energy at the center and was ready to crumble to pieces at the first touch. The rude hand of no Persian or Afghan conqueror, no Nadir Shah, or no Ahmad Abdali, the genius of no European adventurer, or Dupleix or a Clive, was needed to precipitate it into the abyss. In the 18th century, although it was far beyond his power to influence the ultimate destiny of either nation in India, and although the result of his plans was that we accomplished for ourselves against the French exactly everything that the French intended to, the empire of the Mughals was already doomed before any of these had appeared on the scene, and had they never been heard of, there can be little doubt that some Maratha bandit or Sikh freebooter would in due time have seated himself on the throne of Akbar and Shah Jahan. Peter the Great. Bear in mind that the commerce of India is the commerce of the world, and he who can exclusively command it is the dictator of Europe. J.T. Sunderland. India was a far greater industrial and manufacturing nation than any in Europe or any other in Asia. Her textile goods, the fine products of her looms in cotton, wool, linen, and silk, were famous over the civilized world. So were her exquisite jewelry and her precious stones cut in every lovely form. So were her pottery, porcelain, ceramics of every kind, quality, color, and beautiful shape. So were her fine works in metal, iron, steel, silver, and gold. She had great architecture, equal in beauty to any in the world. She had great engineering works. She had great merchants, great businessmen, great bankers, and financiers. Not only was she the greatest shipbuilding nation, but she had great commerce and trade by land and sea, which extended to all known civilized countries. Such was the India which the British found when they came. Abbe Dubois. A Hindu woman can go anywhere alone, even in the most crowded places, and she need never fear the impertinent looks and jokes of idle loungers. G.B. Malleson. Whether regarded as a duel between the foreigner and the native, or as an event pregnant with vast permanent consequences, Buxar takes rank among the most decisive battles ever fought. Not only did the victory of the English save Bengal, not only did it advance the British frontier to Allahabad, but it bound the rulers of Awadh to the conquerors by ties of admiration, of gratitude, of absolute reliance and trust, ties which made them, for the 94 years that followed, the friends of his friends and the enemies of his enemies. Lieutenant Moore. When a person travelling through a strange country finds it well cultivated, populous with industrious inhabitants, cities newly founded, commerce extending, towns increasing, and everything flourishing so as to indicate happiness, he will naturally conclude it to be under a form of government congenial to the minds of the people. This is a picture of Tipu's country. James outran. I'm sick of your policy. I will not say yours is the best, but it is undoubtedly the shortest, that of the sword. Elphinstone. Coming from Afghanistan, it put one in mind of a bully who has been knocked in the street and went home to beat his wife in revenge. R.B. Smith. Sir John Lawrence's foreign policy was a policy of self-reliance and self-restraint, of defense, not defiance, of waiting and watching that he might be able to strike harder and in the right direction if the time for aggressive action should ever come. John Lawrence. Had a single leader of ability arisen among them, the rebels, we must have been lost beyond redemption. Karl Marx. It was the British intruder who broke up the Indian handloom and destroyed the spinning wheel. England began with depriving the Indian cottons from the European market. It then introduced twist into Hindustan and in the end inundated the very mother country of cotton with cottons. Hugh Rose. Here lay the woman who was the only man among the rebels. Eric Stokes. 1857 stands firmly in a historical continuum. Not, of course, it was the direct product of social forces blowing off the political crust, but rather fortuitous conjuncture that laid these forces bend. Like 1848 in Europe, despite obvious disparities, it was on a rising sans issue that could catch a society moving into the early stages of modernization. Stanley Wolpert. It was far more than a mutiny, yet much less than a first war of independence. Bernard Cohen. The British who had started their rule as outsiders became insiders by vesting in their monarch the sovereignty of India. Herbert Risley. Bengal united is a power, Bengal divided will pull in different ways. One of our main objects is to split up and thereby to weaken a solid body of opponents to our rule. H. Asquith called Hunter Report one of the worst outrages in the whole of our history. Dr. Rutherford. Never in the history of the world was such a hoax perpetrated upon a great people as England perpetrated upon India. When in return for India's invaluable service during the war, we gave to the Indian nation such a discreditable, disgraceful, undemocratic, tyrannical constitution. Dr. Conrad Ilst. Khilafat movement was a purely retrograde and reactionary movement, and more importantly for Indian nationalism, it was an intrinsically anti-nationalist movement pitting specifically Islamic interests against secular and non-Muslim interests. Radcliffe. They had absolutely no conception. They asked me to come in and do this sticky job for them, and when I had done it, they hated it. But what could they expect in the circumstances? Surely they must have realized what was coming to them once they had decided on partition. But they had made absolutely no plans for coping with the situation. Angus Madison. There can be no denial that there was a substantial outflow which lasted for over 90 years. If these funds had been invested in India, they could have made a significant contribution to raising income levels. Lord Elgin. We could only govern by maintaining the fact that we were the dominant race. Though Indians and services should be encouraged, there is a point at which we must reserve the control to ourselves, if we are to remain at all. F.G. Hutchins. The British and the princes needed one another. India's need for either was highly doubtful. William Bentinck. The misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of North India. D.H. Buchanan. The armor of the isolated, self-sufficient village was pierced by the steel rail and its lifeblood ebbed away. Macaulay. The servants of the company forced the natives to buy deer and sell sheep. Enormous fortunes were thus rapidly accumulated at Calcutta, while 30 million of human beings were reduced to the extremity of wretchedness. They had never had to live under tyranny like this. John Sullivan. Our system acts very much like a sponge, drawing up all the good things from the bank of the Ganges and squeezing them down on the banks of the Thames. Sir George Wingate. Taxes spent in the country from which they are raised are totally different in their effect from taxes raised in one country and spent in another. In the former case, the taxes collected from the population are again returned to the industrious classes, but the case is wholly different when the taxes are not spent in the country from which they are raised. They constitute an absolute loss and extension of the whole amount withdrawn from the taxed country. The money might as well be thrown into the sea. Such is the nature of the tribute we have so long exacted from India. Charles Wood. All experience teaches us that where a dominant race rules another, the mildest form of government is despotism. R.J. Moore. It was not so much that Britain pursued a policy of divide and rule as that the process of devolving power by stages in a politically and socially desperate country was inherently divisive. Lord Linlithgow, Viceroy. We framed the Act of 1935 because we thought that was the best way of maintaining British influence in India. Winston Churchill. I have not become His Majesty's first minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. Lord Wavell. Our time in India is limited and our power to control events almost gone. We have only prestige and previous momentum to trade on, and these will not last long. Webb Miller. Almost everyone knew that within a few minutes he would be beaten down and perhaps killed. I could detect no signs of wavering or fear. They marched steadily with heads up. Brailsford. Dandi March is the kindergarten stage of revolution, based on the notion that King Emperor can be unseated